Hello, this is Ben, and today we're looking at a Task 1 academic IELTS essay, which came from one of my students. Before we look at the essay, let's look at the task. So you can see it's a bar chart or bar graph, and it is showing the number of imprisonments. It tells you it's given in thousands. So this would be 120,000 imprisonments in 1930, for example, in that year. It's always good to take the time to look at the bar chart or line graph or infographic, whatever it is, carefully, because you need to understand what it's showing. If you don't understand what it's showing exactly, you'll start to use the wrong words. For example, it's not the total number of prisoners, it's the number of new prisoners that year. So the number of people put in prison or jailed that year. And it covers a long period, but it only gives you figures for 6 years in that period. And you got data for 5 countries. Just a quick look at the graph, looking for the key features. One noteworthy point is that the figures for the United States and Canada are always the highest. So that's going to save you time if you talk about those two together. Conveniently, they're both in the same continent, North America, which is not true of the other ones. So if you can find useful ways to organize your information like that, it's very helpful. In general, the figures, they did kind of vary a bit, kind of fluctuated. You can talk about how the gap between these figures was generally similar, but there's actually a huge difference in the last year when the number of imprisonments in the United States was significantly higher than that in Canada. Imprisonments significantly outnumbered those in Canada in that final year. The two countries, I guess, in Oceania, Australia and New Zealand, they generally stayed pretty close too, the biggest gaps being in the first and the last year. They kind of fluctuated. I guess you could talk about those together because the pattern is not too dissimilar. It is for Great Britain. Great Britain had a steady upward trend pretty much. There isn't a trend that clear, anywhere near that clear for the other countries. It would be wrong to say, there's an upward trend for the United States, because there is, but it's not. It's only comparing the first and the last year. It's not accounting for this huge variation, and it just happens to go up at the end. So the trend is fluctuation, really, rather than an upward trend. It just happens to be much larger in the final year. Okay, so let's move on because I'm talking too much. As always, I recommend that you pause the video to read the essay on your own so you can think about what scores you would give before I do the same. And it can be very interesting to see how closely our predicted scores align. So this is the first slide, the second, the third and final. And as always, to try and score as accurately as possible, you should use the band descriptors available on the British Council IELTS website. Make sure you've got the writing test 1 rather than the test 2. A means academic, so you're looking at those ones rather than the general training ones. And I know there's a lot of information here, so on a phone screen it's going to be very small. When we look at them together, I'm going to zoom in. But for you, if you are using a phone and you want to try to score the essay, I suggest having a different device you can use, like a tablet, or just printing this out. So let's take a look at this. So the given bar chart illustrates how many imprisonments had happened in 5 countries over 60 years from 1930. Yeah, it is a bar chart. It does show how many imprisonments, but there are a few awkward things. Imprisonments don't really happen. It's not a natural collocation. We can say how many people were imprisoned or something like that. Just how many imprisonments there were. I know the writer's trying to be fancy by using the past perfect, but there's no reason to use the past perfect here. We're not comparing one time in the past to another time in the past. We're just talking about some past time periods, the periods of 50 years in this case. So, 50 years, not 60 years, so that's just a careless error, not really paying attention. I know there's data given for 6 years, but because there's 10 years between each, it ends up being a 50-year period. And as I said, there's 10 years between each. So if I say over 50 years from 1930, if I'm just reading this and I can't see the bar chart, I might think, oh, so there's lots of data for that 60-year period, but there isn't. There's just data for every 10 years. So I'm gonna add that. So in 5 countries, at 10-year intervals, we're talking about 10-year time intervals, at 10-year intervals, over the 50 years, starting in 1930. Moving on, overall, it's clearly seen that the number of imprisonments in Great Britain showed a gradual upward trend, while the fluctuating trend was represented for other countries. Some good stuff. Overall, it's clearly seen that the number of imprisonments, that's a good start. But imprisonment is a normal countable noun, so imprisonments in Great Britain showed a gradual upward trend. So the figure, the number as it changes, is showing a pattern. It's showing a gradual upward trend. That's quite nice. No reason for the in the next part. Oops, my apologies. Resting my arm on the keyboard there. While a fluctuating trend, what's represented is not right. We can say that the annual number of imprisonments are represented in the graph, for example. I'm just going to say can be seen. Oh, not seen. I've used that already. Can be observed. For other countries, and really the specific other countries shown, I'll add the can be observed for the other countries. The figures for the US and Canada, because it's 2. This is a bit awkward, was more than that of other countries. So those figures were more than those of the other countries during that period. I'm just going to suggest an improvement related to what I said before. Oops, my apologies. The figures for the two North American countries were highest. The end is fine during the given period. We've already had given, so we don't need to use given again. I get a bit sick of it. The only reason I started to teach students to use given, it's quite funny, is that the task says the table below, and my students started to copy this. They would write the table below illustrates. Of course, it's below here because it is literally below the task given. It's below the words, but it's not below the student's response. So I started to say, well, you can say the given bar chart if you want. And that can be used for things like the given periods, but it does get a bit overused by my students sometimes now, like overused to a ridiculous extent. You can just say the bar chart. You don't need to say the given bar chart or the bar chart provided or the bar chart shown. It just adds an extra word if you want to get to the 150 more quickly. The figures for the two North American countries were highest during the period. But I haven't really said what the countries are, so I think I should add that to the introduction. So the given bar chart illustrates how many imprisonments there were in 5 countries at 10-year intervals over the 50 years, starting from 1930. I could just say the countries in question. The countries' data are provided for. The countries in question are, I'm not going to write it all, but, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. To save space, I won't write the names. Okay, so moving on to the detail paragraph. In detail, you discuss it in detail, but you don't just write in detail. The way that expression is used, I'm going to describe my dream last night to you in detail. You don't just start a sentence with in detail. So let's say examining the graph, like the bar graph, or examining the chart in more detail or in closer detail, because we had the general trends before. We're still examining it, but generally. So in more detail, in closer detail, examining the graph in closer detail. It's going to get a bit messy here, sorry. It can be seen that we can see that the figure for Great Britain continuously increased to nearly 80,000 over the given period. There we have it again, being overused, starting from about 30,000, which was the least in 1930. Numbers, we say lowest or smallest. We don't say least. Least is best with an uncountable noun, like the least traffic or the least pollution or something like that. So the lowest number, which was the lowest in 1930, and a fourth. So 1/3, 1/4 is a bit more formal. But also we don't usually say a fourth, we usually say a quarter, so 1/4 of the US. Considering, I don't really get the considering in the next part. Let's delete that. So Australia and New Zealand had similar figures at around, my apologies. So where are we? Australia and New Zealand had similar figures at around 50,000, 70,000, and just below 80,000 in 1940, 1950, 1960, and 1970, respectively. Respectively used to organize information, but I'm a bit confused. Why am I confused? Can you guess? Well, when we use respectively, we're matching things together. So I've got 1, 2, and 3, which should match with 3 years, but I've got 4 years. So I'm a little bit confused. So 50,000, what is that? Is it 1940? Let me check that. So Australia and New Zealand, around 50,000, 70,000, and just below 80,000. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong year. Yeah, it's talking about 1940. Oh, okay, so I see. So it's using 1 for 2 years, and then 70,000, and then 80,000. So it's generally quite well done because they are pretty similar for this period, and you can talk about them very briefly and concisely using respectively. But it's using 1 figure for these 2 years. Okay, so let's change that. So 50,000 in 1940 and 1950, 1960 and 1970 respectively. So it's a bit messy, but I'm showing that 50,000 is actually for 2 years. In the beginning, sounds very general. It's the start of the Bible, isn't it? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the first year, the first one shown in 1930, in the first year, the number of imprisonments in New Zealand was approximately 70,000, which was 30 more than that of Australia. Yeah, I guess that in New Zealand, or that representing New Zealand, you should really try to match if possible. I know it means Australia's figure, but I want to talk about imprisonments in and keep it the same. In the final year, the figure for Australia was the lowest or the smallest, because I said least before. Accounting for used incorrectly here, standing up. Roughly 50,000. Accounting for can be good for task 1 essays, but it's usually used for things like pie charts, giving proportions. It's a bit repetitive, isn't it? Which was 30,000 more than that of, which was 30,000 less than that of. So there's kind of an over-reliance on that structure, which was roughly double that of. It's a student who I recommended using that too in a previous essay, but just is kind of overusing it now. We need to have more range. In the final year, the figure for Australia was the smallest, standing at roughly 50,000, which was 30,000 less, well, really fewer, because it's accountable now. Fewer imprisonments. Not less pollution or some uncountable, and fewer imprisonments than that of New Zealand. And approximately a third of that of the US. Well, okay, let's add a period there. Turning to the figures for the US and Canada, so the two North American countries, both of them were more than that of other countries Okay, so turning to the two figures for those countries. I mean, if you do want to say turning to, it can be okay. I think it's better if there's two separate charts rather than, looking at things in the same chart. Like if you're moving from a bar chart to a pie chart, turning to the pie chart. I don't really like it here, but if we're going to use this, we don't use the same subject like they or them. It sounds a bit weird. So there's no easy way to change this, but I could say, turning to the figures for the US and Canada, there was an overall rise evident in imprisonment figures over the period. Let's get rid of them at least. So both, but using both as a pronoun, both of those, both were. It's getting a bit awkward here. I guess the student's running out of time. Not more than higher than those of other countries. As we said before, for the two North American countries, they were the highest in each of the 6 years for which data are provided. So we're consistently oops, my apologies. Both were consistently the highest. At over 100,000 imprisonments in each of the 6 years shown in that period. The figures again we don't want to be too repetitive. The figures for the US and Canada, USA is a bit more formal than US, but not a huge deal. The figures for the US and Canada started at really 10,000 and 120,000 each. So it means 100,000 for the US and 120,000 for Canada. So each isn't the right word, respectively. We're saying it in that order. And fluctuated. Yeah, we did talk about how over the period they pretty much fluctuated. In the final year, the figure for the US was the most, well, not the most, we can say that there were the most imprisonments. The figure was the highest at 140,000 in the data. I don't really get what in the data is supposed to add in terms of value. And the number of imprisonments in Canada was the second least. Well, it would be lowest, but it's just a problem with the logic. It's actually the highest. It's a factual error. Again, I just think the student's running out of time, but it's the second highest, not the second lowest. Again, we have accounted for used incorrectly, so standing at, or just at 90,000, which was roughly double that of Australia in 1980. Yeah, maybe the number in Australia. Okay, so again, we've got a bit of over-reliance on certain expressions, as you can see. So what would I give this? Task achievement nearly gave a 7, but there is inaccurate detail at the end. It's not the second lowest, it's the second highest. So it would be 6 overall. It does address the requirements of the task. There's an overview. Let's remind myself, talks about the figure for Great Britain going up gradually, and the figures for the US and Canada being the highest consistently. So, sure. But not a 7 because of the inaccuracies. Coherence and cohesion. So for 6, arranges information and ideas coherently and clear overall progression. Definitely uses cohesive devices effectively. Generally. There were some issues. Some overuse, underuse. Well, there's definitely overuse of certain structures. We've talked about that. So, using the figures for example, instead of saying the numbers of imprisonments, the respective numbers of imprisonments for those two countries, that kind of structure is overused a lot, for example. When you're talking about cohesion, it's trying to connect things smoothly, I guess. You want to read it and it's going to be really nice and neat. And sometimes that's just as simple as using like pronouns. So instead of the figures for the US and Canada, I might say like they, or the numbers for those two countries or something like that. There is a lot of overuse. I'm kind of debating whether to give this 6 or 7. I'd probably give it 6. It doesn't really matter too much because it's not going to affect the overall score I'm giving it. But just to let you know, I was kind of, I'd say on the fence for this. I was kind of stuck between 6 or 7 because I did think there was a good logical organization of ideas and clear progression. But rather than some under or overuse, I thought there was a lot of, so not only some, but a lot of overuse in a way that made it very mechanical, overusing things. So I probably would go for 6, but there were good things, just mostly overused being the problem. Lexical resource, I thought it was a clear 6, trying to use less common vocabulary, like accounted for, but using it inaccurately. Accounting for wasn't used correctly. And grammar, a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. There were frequent error-free sentences, I think. Perhaps the errors were more with other things like the word choice. But I don't think there was enough of a variety of complex structures. We talked about the overuse of certain structures, like which was, and again, which was, then that's of, which was, blah, blah, that's of. It's kind of quite reliant on the same structures to produce this relatively error-free writing. So these are the overall scores. It would end up with an overall score of 6, regardless of whether I give 6 or 7 for cohesion and coherence. As always, thank you for watching and listening. I wonder how closely your scoring matched to mine. Please feel free to comment in the videos and let me know. Thank you and bye-bye.